Melanie Phillips, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily.
Very good to see you again. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, as we were just discussing, you were on the program back in 2019. You've seen some of our exhibits over the years. I think Brent gave you a tour of the excavation sites back in 2017. You've been on our campus here in Edmond, Oklahoma. You spoke before quite a large gathering, and then met later, I think, with our staff, and we had lunch together. So
That's right.
you're definitely one of our favorite journalists, and you've been really firing off some pretty powerful articles of late. And of course, your book, The Builder's Stone, just came out this year as well. So we do have a lot to talk about, and I want to get to your book as well. But right now you're on, I guess you're out promoting your book, and you're in the States at the moment.
That's right. I'm currently in Los Angeles, and I've been in Washington, D.C., and in New York and in Boston, talking about the themes of my book. Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to start with, it was a recent interview. I think maybe Foreign Policy sat down with you, and you were talking about the attempts of the Trump administration to talk to the mullahs, in this case, Iran, and to try to make peace deals. And then you made a really interesting statement. It's similar to some of the things that we said years ago. My father talked about the Obama's nuclear deal with Iran being the worst foreign policy disaster in America's history. And you mentioned that at that time, Donald Trump said that it was a bad deal. But then, as you said, it wasn't that it was a bad deal. It's that they had a deal at all, that you shouldn't even
That's right.
really sit down with people like that who don't want peace, but who want to destroy you. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit further?
Yes, I think this has become quite troubling to myself and to several people who are very concerned about Iran and the threat it poses not just to Israel, but to America and to the free world. Because Donald Trump has been very clear. He has said several times now that Iran is not going to get the bomb. And that if Iran doesn't voluntarily agree to dismantle its entire nuclear program, then America will do it for it by force. That Donald Trump would prefer not to do that, but ultimately he will do that. And that was very clear, and people in Israel were very cheered by this because, as you said, we've all lived through the disastrous 2015 Obama brokered nuclear deal with Iran, which lifted sanctions, enabled vast amounts of money to be funneled in to finance Iran's power grab in the region, wage its terrorist war against Israel and the world, and proceed to assemble what it needs to assemble, particularly uranium enrichment, to get a bomb. And my understanding, and I know nothing other than what I'm reading in the public prints, is that it is at the point of making a bomb. It is no longer useful to talk about stopping uranium enrichment. It's enriched it. And it's at the point now of working out how to fit warheads to missiles. So this is to put it mildly, a few seconds before midnight.
Right.
Now, what Donald Trump said originally was fine, except that he does believe, in my view, that he can do deals that nobody else can do. He seems to believe that all conflicts in the world are potential deals which can be done if he is doing them. His problem, as I recall, with the 2015 Obama deal was that it wasn't a good deal, that he could have done a better deal. Now, this to me is a terrible mistake because I don't doubt Donald Trump's skills as a deal maker, but there are some agendas which are simply non-negotiable. The Ayatollahs of Iran are run or adhere, the governing the people who run the regime are governed by a religious ideology which holds that if they produce the apocalypse, they will bring to earth the Shia Messiah, the 12th Imam. Now, if you have people who believe that it's a religious duty to wage war on the West and to destroy Israel and the Jews, then there's no negotiation. There's no negotiation with that agenda. There's no negotiation possible that is not seen by them as a surrender and as a kind of inspiration to ratchet up their aggression. So this is what worries me. President Trump has recently said that negotiations with Iran, which are proceeding, are going very well. He has hailed their great intelligence. Well, of course they're great. They're vastly intelligent. They are probably the greatest multi-dimensional geostrategic chess players in the world. Um, they appear to be running rings around the American administration if one believes that the Trump administration is really thinking that a deal can be made. There is no deal that can be made with these people because their agenda is non-negotiable, and they have simply to be defeated, and their nuclear program, the entire infrastructure of that program, needs to be destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of deals too, you had a column back at the start of this year. This was when President Trump was coming into office. His inauguration was on January 20th, and he was really pressuring Israel through Qatar to have some kind of a deal that would presumably release the hostages, and there'd be a ceasefire and so on and so forth. And at that time, you talked about, making a deal with the devil, basically. And you also talked about how there were Israelis wondering how President Trump could betray Israel this way with such a lopsided agreement. Here again, besides my father, I just was not seeing really any commentary along those lines and I forget when you wrote that column, but it was, I think, in January or February.
Yes, I wrote it shortly after this occurred. I think it was either on on the inauguration or very, very soon after, that through President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, the administration pressured Israel to have a ceasefire, which was disastrous because a ceasefire released pressure on Hamas. It enabled them to regroup and to recover from the damage that Israel was doing. What was enforced upon Israel was to allow into Gaza much, much more humanitarian aid, most of which was stolen and appropriated by Hamas in order to service their war machine. And when the war resumed in Gaza, Israel was at a disadvantage. Hamas had regrouped, so this was disastrous. And again, it's the same principle that all conflict is amenable to negotiation. I mean, my view about the hostage negotiation, which has now gone on for 19 months, is that the Hamas took the hostages for one reason only, that they knew that this was the ultimate weapon which would enable them to ensure that Israel did not ultimately defeat them. Because ultimately they held if I can use the metaphor now, the phrase, they held the trump card, which was the hostages. Israel would, go to great lengths, to put it mildly, to not have them harmed. And the negotiations were, in my view, a farce because America was negotiating with Qatar, as if Qatar was an honest broker in this, as if it was an independent interlocutor. It's not. Qatar is, to all intents and purposes, Hamas. It funds Hamas. It shields all its senior operatives. And it was an absolute farce that they were negotiating effectively with Hamas, which was then able, through its notional proxy, Qatar, to dictate the terms, which meant that they would never, ever release the hostages because they always had to have this weapon against Israel. So we saw some of them were released, but that was when Israel was putting tremendous military pressure on them. So they kind of tactically withdrew at that point and released some of the hostages.
Yeah.
But the idea that they would voluntarily let them go, the idea that, if they were finally to decide that, the game is up, they'll kill them.
Yeah.
Because their only value to them is to stop Israel from ever winning And if they were ever to think that Israel was winning and that, there was no chance that Hamas could survive, they'll kill them.
Yeah.
So this is a terrible thing. And, Qatar is Hamas. We saw that, was it just a few weeks ago, when President Trump did the deal behind Israel's back to release Eden Alexander, the American-Israeli hostage. And we saw that Qatar basically snapped its fingers and he was released. Now, Qatar, if could have released got the hostages released at any time. If America, if the Biden administration at that time had said on October the 8th, and if the Trump administration had said when the Trump administration came in, had said to Qatar, unless you release all the hostages or all the remaining hostages within 24 hours unharmed, we remove our whatever it is their airbase in Doha, whatever it is they're having in Qatar, and you're out of here. We don't care that you are funding all our universities. We don't care that you're funding all kinds of stuff in America. As far as we're concerned, you will be treated as a rogue state. The war would have ended that day. The hostages would have been released. Neither the Biden nor the Trump administrations has chosen to do so. This is very, very troubling indeed.
Yeah.
It suggests that the financial ties between Qatar and America, and between Qatar and my home country of London, of Britain, are so extensive that the West can't extricate itself, or chooses not to extricate itself, from a relationship with Qatar, which is just simply too lucrative.
Yeah. We've played this clip. It's from 2017, so this is right as President Trump is coming into office the first time around. And he was, I think, on the White House lawn, and this is what he had to say about Qatar. Play that one for us, Sam.
The time had come to call on Qatar to end its funding. They have to end that funding. And its extremist ideology in terms of funding.
And he also said in that same speech that even, that we're going to, the easy way is to appease and the hard way is to confront this, Qatar and some of these other sponsors of terrorism. But he talked about going after those that even sponsored terrorism, morally, or like got behind it, with their support, verbally, of financing, obviously. But that's 2017. I mean, you had said that we're now so entangled in these financial connections with countries like Qatar. Do you feel like it's mostly just money and deal making that would explain why the thinking has changed so much, even for conservatives, Republicans?
Well, I assume that's a very large part of the problem. I mean, there are a number of people, including Mr. Witkoff, who seem to have extensive ties and obligations to Qatar. So that must have an influence. But I think there's also another factor which has arrived with the second Trump administration, which is that he has said many times he wants to be the president that brings peace. He wants to be the president that ends war. He doesn't want to have violence. Now, that is a very laudable aim. We all want to have an end to war. We all want peace. But you don't want to have the kind of peace that comes from a surrender to people who are going to wipe out Israel and kill Jews, and then as a precursor to destroying the West. That's not peace with justice. That's not the real peace. That's a surrender to an unconscionable agenda. And so, what President Trump said, his remarks about Qatar being the funder of terror and so on was absolutely correct. But I think this has been complicated. His view has been complicated by his demonstrable determination to be the president that ends war, that doesn't do violence. And I think this is getting in the way, because while none of us wants war, none of us wants violence, if you've had negotiations and they've ended in disaster and worse, if you can see that the enemy is using negotiation as a lever to continue to ratchet up its aggression, then you have no alternative sometimes but to wage war, but to use violence to achieve your noble aim.
Right. You said in that column back around the inauguration that Donald Trump does not want war under his watch. And I mean, just the fact that he's openly stating that to everybody, it just kind of takes away any leverage that the United States might have in a negotiation.
Exactly.
Because if you know, Putin or the mullahs or whoever knows that there's not going to be, you know what to pay, as Donald Trump said that there would be if the hostages weren't released, then again, they can just keep playing the United States, right?
Well, exactly. And the irony is that President Trump is in danger of ending up in exactly the same position as his foe, President Biden, who, he mocked, and everybody who is right thinking mocked for having produced this terrible situation in which America was no longer the leader of the free world, but was being made a fool of by Iran and other countries, by Russia, by China, by the bad actors in the world who perceived correctly that under the Democrat administration, America was no longer prepared to fight in defense of its values. And then along comes President Trump, who obviously, is from a completely different mindset. But he wants to avoid war and bring peace. So he ends up in the same position as his mortal foes on the left, for whom, the liberal leftist world, believes that war is a terrible thing, which it is, but war is so terrible that it never solves anything. How many times have I heard people on the left say this in the last few months? War never solves anything. I mean, what did they think happened in 1940? When the Allies eventually won the war against the Nazis, because the only reason why the free world is still free is because war was waged against the Nazi regime. And so this is completely ridiculous. But the left hold it as an kind of sort of article of faith that you don't do war, you do conflict resolution, you do negotiation, you do compromise, you do peace processes, that in a fight between God and the devil, you split the difference. That's where the left is, and it's odious. It ends up supporting and promoting evil in the world. Now, the Republican Party and President Trump come from a different perspective, but he's ending up in the same place, because if he won't do war, he won't use the mechanism of war to achieve the most righteous of ends and most necessary of ends, then he's going to end up in exactly the same place as the left, in being the handmaidens of evil.
Right. Last week you had a column on the split in the MAGA movement. Is this something that was inspired by even your visit to the United States here the last many days that you've been over here, or is this something you had been thinking about for a while?
It's certainly something I've been thinking about for a while, and I've been much informed by conversations I've had on my trip here at the moment to the United States, that there does seem to be a split in the MAGA movement, because, President Trump was brought to power basically by the wishes of millions and millions of extremely, what I would call middle America, centrist Americans, who perceive that under the Democrats who are in power, both at national and local level, America had lurched into a kind of insanity in which, there was no such thing as truth. Everything was a matter of opinion, in which you had a victim culture in which people dodged moral responsibility for their actions and blamed people who were the victims of what they were doing. You had anarchy on the streets, which was lauded, the Black Lives Matter onslaught upon the rule of law, upon the police, upon white people, was lauded. You had the demonization of white people by Black people on the absolutely ludicrous grounds that this was anti-racism. There's nothing more racially prejudiced than damning everybody on the basis of the color of their skin. I mean, it was monstrous. And you had other stuff, the transgender madness, and the fact that, the border, there was no longer a policed border, that, you had mass illegal immigration. And if you don't have a policed border, you don't have a nation. A nation exists within a border. All those sorts of things I think that people were entirely right and sort of sane and centrist to object to. And that's what brought President Trump to power, because those people perceived that the whole political establishment, the Democratic Party most certainly, but also the kind of more mainstream Republican Party, had gone along with all this and had promoted it and gone along with it. And so they elected President Trump as an outlier, as a disruptor of a political a way of thinking that was driving America into rack and ruin. And so I thought that was great. That's why he was brought to power. But in the same movement, there are people who are not, I would call, centrist at all. They are people who have a view of the world which is essentially conspiratorial, which believes that they seem to think that the world is so perplexing and so inexplicable, it can only be explained by conspiracy theories. And this is because they are fundamentally isolationists. They seem to believe that, America is this vast place which is entirely self-sufficient, which doesn't need anything from anywhere else, and can get along absolutely fine without recourse to the rest of the world at all, because it is so big and it is so productive and it is so wonderful in every regard. And consequently, if things aren't going absolutely right, like the aftershocks of the October 8th, the 2008 financial crisis, and also the humiliations and worse of America's entanglement in first Vietnam, and then in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which humiliated America, which young people died. For what, people ask themselves. I think this embittered a lot of people, and it made them think that there must be some force that was actually producing this terrible situation in which America had kind of lost its way. And so that leads those people down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory, which leads them straight into rank Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, in which they alight upon the people who have always been blamed as a conspiracy against the interests of everybody else, in circumstances where so many people can't explain what's going on. And so those people are represented in the MAGA movement, and to my horror, they are represented in the Trump administration. It would appear that President Trump wants to ride both horses. He sees that both wings of this movement are necessary for him to maintain a majority support in the population. And that is very troubling, because I think that those people are giving him very bad advice. I think those are the people who are saying to him, you must make a deal with Iran, that Israel is the problem, that it's Israel's fault that there is war, and all that kind of stuff. I surmise, I don't know, I'm just drawing a conclusion from what I have read, what I've thought about, what I've seen, what I'm being told. But that, I think, is very troubling. I think that split is very troubling.
Well, yeah, there have been conservative commentators that have made some pretty stunning statements about the Jews, and it is shocking to see this play out, even, as you say, in the MAGA movement and even in the West Wing. I mean, this probably explains why there's evidently a rift between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I mean, he went on that trip last week or week before, didn't visit Israel, had all these wonderful things to say about, the new leader in Syria and Qatar and all that. And then J.D. Vance also skipped Israel. So from you spend a lot of your time in Israel. What's Israel's take on the relationship right now between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, I think a lot of people are very, very worried. When President Trump was elected second time round, unless you were a liberal stroke leftist who hates Prime Minister Netanyahu, hates what they call the right, and sees everything through that prism, unless you were one of those people, Israelis were immensely to put it mildly, relieved by President Trump's election because they felt they dodged a bullet. They felt that if Kamala Harris had won, if the Democratic Party had again been in power, Israel would have been in a very difficult position indeed. It was bad enough under President Biden, but under Kamala Harris, it was perceived that the Democratic Party would be unleashed in its extremist attitude of hostility to Israel. So everyone was very thrilled and relieved to see President Trump back in the White House. And now they're not sure. They believe, I think, that President Trump's, I believe that President Trump's feelings towards Israel remain warm and supportive. And his attitude towards the Jewish people is extremely warm and supportive. I see no reason to doubt that whatsoever. But I think that whether it's because these people that I've been talking about, these conspiracy theorists, these anti-Semites in his administration, whether it's they who are, having words in his ear and influencing him, or whether it's because, he said, I want to have, peace in the region, like as soon as I come into office. And it's not happened. Mm-hmm. And he's the kind of man who would be very impatient with that. And he wouldn't sort of necessarily think it all through and think there are the following complex reasons why this hasn't happened and that hasn't happened. He probably thinks, Netanyahu is just dragging his feet, which is what he's basically said. Yeah. Why isn't this war finished already? Right. And there are many reasons why the war isn't finished already. Partly it's because America is putting pressure on Israel to drag its feet because of the hostage negotiations. Partly because the hostages are still there. Right. And because Israel is terrified of having them, of causing them to be killed. Mm-hmm. It complicates the matter enormously having hostages there. And there are all kinds of reasons like that. Some of which we know, some of which we can guess at, some of which we have no idea about. But I would guess that President Trump is just being very impatient. He wants the war done. He wants it all done and dusted because he wants to, to proceed to the next stage in bringing peace to the region, which is a fine ambition. But I suspect he's the kind of guy who just, he brushes aside the very reasonable explanations of why this has not been possible and starts blaming people who are doing their best to make it possible, but are finding it very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing we point out on this program often is it's in the Gospels, the verse that talks about judging by fruits and not just, going by the words that are said. And that's why we, when we hear these statements made about the Syrian leader or Qatar or, just terrorists in general, Vladimir Putin, as I said earlier, we're just kind of stunned that people would just take, like Steve Witkoff you mentioned earlier, just take a statement from one of these tyrants or dictators and think that, well, there's a deal to be made here then, or as you said, anything can be, I think you said it in one of your columns, anything can be solved with money, and everyone's happy. But I think one thing that you bring out in your book that was really, really amazing is just when you were talking about human nature and this idea that, everyone can be trusted. And I think it's early on in your book, and you were basically saying that no, you especially when they're in nations that aren't brought up under the Judeo-Christian ethic and system of morality, and of course that's what you're saying in your book is crumbling even in our nations. But then if it's another nation with a radical ideology, you can't. I think it was General Flynn last week who said, the moment Iran signs a peace agreement, they'll violate it the very next day. That's just what they've done. So last week you had another powerful column on blood on their hands. This was following the murder of the two Israeli embassy, the young people there, the Jews in Washington, D.C. Terrorism happening right in the backyard of the White House. I read one commentary that said, this hopefully will be a wake-up call. And as I said on my program, October 7 wasn't even a wake-up call, not the way that it should have been for the West.
Right.
And so here these two Jews are murdered, and it's in the news cycle for a day or two, and then it's just it's quickly forgotten. And you said, and you went through the history, the recent history, and all the propaganda, 14,000 Palestinian babies are going to die in 2 days, and how that the media is just out there promoting these lies. And then, of course, following October 7, all of the pro-Hamas demonstrations around the world, and people aren't held to account, and there is blood on their hands. If you could maybe just elaborate on how the murder of those 2 young people last week impacted you and led into that powerful column.
Yeah, well, I mean, the alleged murderer shouted, "Free, free Palestine," and I did this for Gaza. And so people put 2 and 2 together and made the correct assumption that he had been radicalized, if I can use that word. He'd been radicalized to basically want to murder people. He'd been radicalized by the rubbish that we've heard on the streets for the last 19 months, on campus, in demonstrations, in which Israel is painted as the aggressor in the region, as the committer of war crimes, as the perpetrators of genocide, whereas in fact Israel is not only innocent of those things, not only going to enormous lengths to preserve the civilian lives in Gaza as far as it can, but is actually the victim of those things. It's the victim of an attempted genocide. It's the victim of war crimes. And so this is, to put it mildly, perverse. And we've now seen what free Palestine actually means. It does not mean supporting the oppressed Palestinians, the so-called oppressed Palestinian Arabs of Gaza. It does not even mean being anti-Israel. Free Gaza means the murder of people assumed to be Jews. I say assumed because I think one of these 2 victims was actually a Christian. But basically, they were both working at the Israel embassy in Washington, D.C., and they both had committed their lives to the Jewish project of the State of Israel. And so they were singled out. They were killed because they were part of a mindset in this young murderer who saw a Jewish event. It was at the Jewish Museum involving Jews, and he wanted those Jews to be killed. So there was a direct connection between what he was screaming as Free Palestine and the killing of Jews. And what I said, what I think, is that this is a very important connection to make, because the cause by which under which all these people are demonstrating on the streets and on campus represents something much more than just the issue that they purport to be demonstrating about. What I've said in my book is that October 7, the atrocities of October 7, 2023, threw down a kind of challenge to the West. Do you support civilization or do you support barbarism? And unfortunately, the West has shown ever since that it does not support civilization. I mean, here you had, a genocidal attack, unbelievably barbarous. It wasn't just killing people. It was savage and depraved slaughter involving, as we know, not just murder, but rape and beheadings and burning people alive and murdering children in front of their parents and so on. And you would expect that the civilized world would have said, well, obviously, Israel has to do whatever it takes to stop this, because these people who've done this are threatening to do it again and again until the state of Israel is eliminated, until every Jew is killed, and then they're going to come after the West. Then they say so. They're going to come after America. They're going to come after the West. They're going to come after the Christian world. They say so in turns. But instead of taking that view, the West turned against Israel, blamed it for effectively its own slaughter, accused it of crimes of which it was innocent and the victim, and so on and so forth. And what my book is saying is this, that in order to understand this appalling reaction to October 7 by the West. One has to understand what the West has done to itself. And in order to understand what the West has done to itself, one has to understand that the West is at war with the Jewish people and Judaism. For this reason, as I say in my book, and as I've written for decades, the West's elites, its intelligentsia, the people who run the culture, have basically taken a wrecking ball to Western civilization and the Western nation and its core values on the basis that the West is fundamentally bad because it was born in the original sins of colonialism and imperialism and racism and all that sort of stuff. And so you have to basically demolish it and replace it by something better, which is universalism, brotherhood of man, transnational institutions. So I've been writing for years about the onslaught on the traditional family, the onslaught on education as the transmission of a culture, the onslaught on the very idea of the nation, the elevation of universalist values through transnational institutions, and so on. And at the root of that onslaught on the West is the onslaught on its core values. Its core values, as we know, are largely implanted in the West by Christianity, the foundational creed of the West. Okay, the Greeks had quite a lot of input as well, but nevertheless, Christianity is the foundational creed of the West. And Christianity itself didn't come from nowhere. Its parent is Judaism. And the values that everybody in the West holds dear or purports to hold dear, whether they are religious people, whether they are people of no faith, they are biblical values. And so the West's onslaught on itself has been, in effect, an onslaught on biblical values. I've said in the book at great length that few people understand the immense importance of those values of the Hebrew Bible to the West's civilization and greatness. Few understand how extensive that influence has been and how important it is and has been to the greatness of the West. And so it's not surprising that a civilization, a society, a culture, the West, which is turned on itself, has turned on the Jews, the ultimate architects or the creators, the inspirers of its core values. And it's turned on the Jews both through the state of Israel and through its onslaught on Jews as people, through this tsunami of Jew hatred that we're seeing throughout the West. And what I say in my book is this, that this has brought the West to a parlous situation in which it's kind of teetering on the edge of the cultural cliff. And there are many people who think that, it's not going to survive. It's created a kind of vacuum. It doesn't know what its identity is anymore. It's tried to destroy it. It's no longer prepared to fight and die for it. And into that vacuum have come predatory Islamists, people who understand that without the scaffolding of a religion at its core, a society cannot exist anymore, is vulnerable. And so they've marched in through both terrorism, threats, subversion of the democratic process, having lots of babies. It's a strategy, take over the West. So many people in the West think, well, it's all over. We can't survive this. It's finished. The West is finished. And I'm saying in the book, no, actually, no. It could be. I don't know whether the West even wants to survive. And can it pull itself on the brink, back from the brink like this? After all it's done to itself? I'm not sure. But if it wants to survive, I think it has a very good shot. But it has to do two things. It has to learn to love itself as a culture. It has to learn to celebrate what it is. It has to understand the part played in it by Christianity. It has to return to those biblical values. It has to uphold them and understand that it's adopted ideologies which have undermined those biblical values. And it has to learn to love the people who are at the very heart of those biblical values, the Jews, for two reasons. The Jews do cultural survival. It's their unique selling point. They have survived everything that's ever been thrown at them. And they can tell the West how you do cultural survival, how you keep the cultural show on the road. The Jews know that better than anybody. They have a lot of very practical, useful guidance to impart. And at the same time, it's by no coincidence that the values of the Jews are indeed the values of the West. And if those two things are understood, and the West comes to love the Jews instead of disdaining them and wanting to eradicate their unique qualities and the unique contribution they've made to the West, if the West comes to love the Jews instead and listen to them, then I think that the West can indeed be saved. And what I'm saying in my final chapter is that I hope that there would be what I call a countercultural resistance movement growing, a kind of coalition of everybody from every conceivable creed and culture and ethnicity and group, women and men, left and right, black and white, gays and straights, one religion after, all people of all religions, including Islam. Muslims, there are plenty of Muslims who want the West to continue and understand it. People of all religions and people of no religion, all combining in a kind of coalition, which I think should be led by Jews and Christians, because these are the foundational creeds of the West. There should be this coalition of people who want the West to survive, understand that its values are not universal; they are particular to it. They are particular to it because they're founded essentially in the Bible, and will do what needs to be done to pull it back, which I think could be done if the will was there and if the leadership was there. That's basically what my book's about.
Yeah. We produced a booklet, just a short little booklet 25 years ago, but it just went through all the founders of the United States and many that were involved in, writing the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. And all of them, for the most part, maybe I can't say all, but even the ones that weren't very religious said that religion and morality is that's going to be how this experiment lives long. If you get away from those foundational underpinnings,
exactly,
then you have really like you say in your book, if it does come down to an aggressive enemy nation, you have to have something that you believe in and are willing to fight for. But if that's stripped away, then no one's going to take to the battlefield to defend those core values of the West. Precisely. And I'm afraid the West doesn't understand this, or rather its intelligentsia doesn't understand it. Yeah.
I think there are millions and millions of ordinary people who find themselves abandoned by their political establishment, just as we were discussing earlier, because their political establishment is run by the intelligentsia, basically, the people who run the culture. And they've turned against it. They don't understand what it is. They don't understand what civilization is. They don't understand the West invented it. It's not just Western civilization as an adjective. The West invented what we call civilized values, and that's because they were values that came from the Bible. And people either don't know that, or they deny it, or they don't want to know it. But it is essential, if the West is to survive, that is acknowledged and built upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're I guess some of the stuff you had at the start of your book, you kind of just summarized it there really, really well. But the point about the nature or the heart of man, as the Bible talks about, you said, I think this is on page 28, the notion that human beings are somehow hardwired to be fair, compassionate, and empathetic, to seek cooperation rather than conquest, and to respect human life has been repeatedly shown to be false in cultures where these values are unknown. And what you're saying there is that we have to be taught these values, and that these values are taught in the Holy Scriptures, whether the Old Testament or the New, I believe. So yeah, that, going back to the judging by fruits concept, the fact that we're so willing to just take what, someone that really says openly, as you said earlier, I want to destroy these people from the river to the sea, free Palestine and so on, then go after the great Satan and so on. What is it like regarding Steve Witkoff and just so many of the nice things that he said as he's traveled through the Middle East about terrorists? I think you said recently when he made the comments, or maybe it was President Trump, I forget who, but the new leader in Syria, I forget his name, but he's Al-Qaeda through and through. But you said, he doesn't just change his nature by trimming his beard and putting on a nice suit. Another column recently said that we're basically dealing with jihadists in suits, when we're talking with all of the leaders of Qatar and so on. What was your take on, because he kind of came out of nowhere, at least from my perspective, but now, you almost hear about Steve Witkoff with respect to foreign policy and diplomacy, certainly within the Middle East, more than you even hear of Secretary Rubio. I mean, that seems to be President Trump's point man. So how has your take? Did you know much about this man's background before he came in? I mean, you mentioned the ties that he had business-wise with Qatar. But what do you make of his traveling the region and some of the statements he's made about those that don't like Israel very much and that have historically been enemies of the United States too?
Oh, well, it's very, very alarming because he seems not to understand the first thing about what he's dealing with. Put aside, his financial ties to Qatar and so on. I think what he's demonstrating is the sort of great fallacy of the West. I mean, you talk about, the outreach to the new Syrian guy, al-Shara, if that's his name, I mean, the idea that you could be a reformed Islamist is ridiculous because it requires you to believe that on one day, when he was an Islamist fanatic, he believed that he had a sacred duty. He was enjoined by God to destroy the non-Islamic world. Sacred duty. And then the next day, apparently, he stopped having that sacred duty. I mean, if you believe it's a sacred duty, you don't suddenly. What are we all supposed to think? That he lost his faith? It's unlikely. It's much more likely that he is extremely shrewd and is playing a long game, hence the trimmed beard and the suit and so on. Now, when it comes to Mr. Witkoff, and he's not alone in this, I would say there are so many people in the West who think like this. They assume that, first of all, that values are universal, as you said before, that the things that we hold to be civilized in the West are universal, that they're universally understood and demanded by everybody else. The rule of law, the respect for every human life, equality for women, and all that kind of stuff. This is universal. It's nonsense. It's particular to the West. But the West believes, or certain people in the West, certainly the intelligentsia, certainly people on the left, liberals, believe that everyone in the world is like them. It's so arrogant. It is so unbelievably arrogant. They believe that everybody is like them. In other words, everybody is just like they are, they think themselves, governed by reason and rationality and self-interest. And so everyone is susceptible to appeals to reason and to self-interest. You can basically buy anybody. And this is why President Trump's leitmotif of the art of the deal, followed by, I'm sure, Mr. Witkoff, lines them up absolutely with people on the left. People on the left believe that everything is a matter of negotiation. Every conflict is a matter of negotiation and compromise because basically everybody is rational. Everybody is governed by self-interest. And so, all you have to do is put people in the room, bash their heads together with enough inducements and enough threats, and they're rational. They're self-interested. They will do the deal in their own interest because they're rational. That's what the left thinks. That's why you have negotiations, peace processes, conflict resolution. Messrs. Trump and Witkoff don't think that. They don't have leftist thinking like that. But they do believe in the art of the deal. They do believe that everything is a potential deal. They also believe, therefore, that everybody in the world is governed by self-interest and, therefore, reason and rationality. And so when they look at Iran, they look at Mr. al-Shara in Syria, they look at the Ayatollahs in Iran. They're looking at people who believe implacably they have a sacred duty to God to murder a vast number of people, to destroy the non-Islamic world. And they're looking at these people and they don't understand that. They can't get their heads around that. They do not understand what a religious fanatic is, because in their world, everything is a potential deal. Everybody is a potential deal maker because everybody, including the Ayatollahs of Iran, including Mr. al-Shara in Syria, everybody is governed by self-interest. So they end up in exactly the same position as their foes on the left. And it's nonsense. It's beyond nonsense. It's so lethally destructive, and it produces war and it produces war on the terms laid down by
Right.
the warmongers, by the Islamic fanatics,
Yeah.
because the West doesn't understand what it's dealing with. It denies all the time what it's dealing with. This is so fundamental to what's gone wrong, both in terms of what's happening internally in Britain, in America, faced with, an Islamist push to Islamize the West. The West says, no, 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 people aren't like that. They're all rational and self-interested, and why on earth would they behave like that? Because they don't understand what it is to be a religious fanatic, and this is influencing both the internal rot within the West and the its inability to properly confront the dangers that threaten it from outside.
Yeah. Some time ago, this is a month or two ago, Steve Witkoff sat down with Tucker Carlson. I think it's clip one. They were talking about the leader of Syria and how that he's a changed man. Listen to this exchange, clip one.
I think we'll prove that they won't be an existential risk either. But if we can get these terrorist organizations eliminated as risks, not existential, but still risks, they're destabilizing risks, then we'll normalize everywhere. I think Lebanon could normalize with Israel, literally. Normalize meaning a peace treaty with the two countries. That's really possible. Syria, too. The indications are that Jelani is a different person than he once was, and people do change. You at 55 are completely different than how you were at 35.
That's for
sure. I say to myself, I'm a different person today at 68 years old. I'm not the person I knew 30 years ago. So maybe Jelani in Syria is a different guy.
So he's a different guy. He's a changed man. And I noted on my show the other day how it was in the same interview that Witkoff said that one reason they're having these breakthrough conversations with Qatar and UAE and Saudi Arabia is because they're young people and they don't have those old sensibilities. So as I said on the show, I mean, which is it? Do we get to be 55 and we're a changed man and we're no longer a hardened terrorist or a religious fanatic? Or do we need to work with the young people who don't have all of those old sensibilities that their parents had or their grandparents had? So maybe you could comment on just going back to the religious fanaticism and ideology. Young people today, I mean, in the West, there's a steady diet of propaganda that they're getting on university campuses and so on. But how religious and fanatical do you feel the young generation in the Islamic world is or has been, let's say, in recent years?
Well, first of all, people do change. That is perfectly true. And people who have signed up in the past, in their youth, for a fanatical view of religion do change, but that follows from their losing their faith. They don't retain the same faith and then kind of deny an important part of what was their faith. So that's why that's so ridiculous. As far as young people are concerned, if you're talking about young people within the Islamic world, I mean, I'm just thinking about the Palestinian Arabs. For generations, they have, young Arabs in Gaza, in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria called the West Bank. For generations, they have been indoctrinated with a lesson that their highest calling is to grow up to murder Jews and steal their land. They are told that they are the rightful heirs to the land. They are the indigenous people of the land, and it's all because this idea that if Muslims ever were in control of a territory, then that's theirs rightfully forever. It's all of that. So they're indoctrinated into this, and people in the West do not understand this. They do not understand that when it comes to, say, Gaza, you have a situation in which the Gazans are really oppressed by their Hamas rulers. They are jailed and imprisoned and tortured if they're dissidents. They are starved, during this war. Hamas has stolen much of the food for themselves, much of the aid, and has sold the rest on the black market at hugely inflated prices, which Gazans can't afford. Okay, so a lot of them hate Hamas, and that's now on the streets increasingly. But what people in the West can't get their heads around, even if they understand that they are demonstrating against Hamas, which they don't even know because the Western media won't tell them even that. But they can't understand that if you're an Arab in Gaza, you may hate Hamas, but you will hate the Jews more, because all opinion polling has shown consistently that both in Gaza and in the so-called West Bank, the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, the vast majority of Arabs, when polled, say that they support what happened on October 7. They would wish it to happen again. They want to see the Israelis killed. They want Israel destroyed. So, you're dealing with a whole community which is signed up to the ideology of genocide and theft of another people's cultural identity in the land. And that's what, again, the West cannot understand, because it thinks of everybody in its own terms, like Mr. Witkoff.
Yeah.
Everybody can change. Well, people can change, but the reality of living in a totalitarian universe where it is simply not possible for you to think differently, because your parents and your teachers and the people who've taught your parents and their teachers and the people who taught them have all said the same thing, which is hate Jews, kill them, steal their land, because it's ours of right, because we are Muslims. The average Westerner cannot get his or her head around that, because, like Mr. Witkoff, they insist on seeing everybody like themselves. Steve Witkoff, changed in my 50s, so therefore everybody can change in their 50s. Well, no, because you, Steve Witkoff, were not brought up to believe that you have a sacred duty to God to destroy the world for Islam. I mean, and they just don't understand.
Yeah.
And it is an arrogance. It's a cultural arrogance,
Yeah.
Which is the West's undoing.
Yeah. From your book, it says, it has often been said that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. A society that turns on the Jews is a society in deep trouble. And then you say the reaction to the October 7 onslaught showed just how much trouble the West is in. It revealed a culture in an advanced state of decay and disintegration. And then I think it's a little bit later on, you mentioned how, and we made the same point, I think October 7 was on a Saturday, and we made this point on the show, I believe Monday, that the sympathy for the Jews would last for a few hours, and then the onslaught would, as you put it, what then erupted was a tsunami of brazen, frenzied Israel hatred and anti-Semitism. Were Israelis, I mean, they were seeing this on international news outlets and so on. Were they just stunned and shocked that the world reaction after October 7 would be the way that it was, with people taking to the streets in the UK and in New York and all across America in support of Hamas?
They behave as any sane person would behave. They are absolutely stunned and shocked.
Yeah.
They can't really believe it. Unless you come and live in Israel, or unless you come and live in Britain or America, you take the temperature of what's going on in Britain and America and other European countries. It's impossible for any normal person to grasp the derangement that has taken hold of so many in the West. If you're an Israeli, you're facing this terrible situation of a genocidal enemy that says, in terms, we're going to destroy you. An enemy which has perpetrated the most savage and depraved atrocities against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And this in a society, as you may know, it's a very small country, 10 million people. There's not a household that's not somehow affected by this. They've had people who have been murdered, or taken hostage, or they know people who are those families. They have children, grandchildren, the grandchildren, children of friends or relatives who are serving in Gaza. They've served in Lebanon. Some of them, a lot of them have died. Um, a lot of them have come back alive, but missing limbs. The trauma of the families involved is indescribable. And they're looking at the outside world and they're thinking, how can any civilized human being not see this and not understand that we are the victims here and that we need to be supported?
Right.
How can any civilized country be permitting these demonstrations on campus, on the streets, week after week for 19 months, in which they are supporting genocidal mass murder on the basis that this is somehow an expression of liberal, progressive compassion? People in Israel cannot understand it. It is completely impossible to understand, except to say that the West has basically lost its mind. It's lost its conscience. It's lost its rationality, its reason. It's lost its sense of justice, its sense of right and wrong. And what I say in the book is that it's not surprising that that's the reaction, because that is exactly what the West has done to itself over these decades. It's destroyed its conscience. It's destroyed its sense of justice, its sense of right and wrong. There's no such thing as truth. Everything's a matter of opinion. And it's destroyed its rationality. You cannot bring evidence to bear. You cannot say, look at what's happening in Gaza. Look at the fact that, all these thousands of tons of aid have poured in and have been stolen by Hamas. You can't say. The evidence is absolutely unequivocal that Israel is always trying to save life. The evidence is unequivocal that the Jews are the rightful and indigenous people of the land, that they inherited it, that they are the people, the only people who have a legal and historical right to the land. You can bring fact after fact to adduce all these, to back up all these arguments. It goes nowhere, because we're living in a society in the West where evidence and facts no longer have any traction. We're told, this is just your opinion and you are partisan. So we dismiss your opinion. We prefer our opinion because it makes us feel good, because we can pretend to ourselves that we are supporting the oppressed of the earth. That's what we're up against. So in Israel, every day they are coping with this trauma, this collective trauma. And I have to say, in addition, it's an amazing thing, as you may know, in Israel, side by side with this trauma and grief that are off the scale, is an optimism and a determination and a certainty that Israel is going to survive this, whatever horrors still lie in store, and an amazing happiness among the people, which are astounding. You wouldn't find that anywhere else. It is simply astounding how these things all exist together, the trauma and the optimism. But they're looking at the world, at the West, and thinking, well, it's just impossible to understand.
Yeah. The Washington Post, you may have seen this, I think it's from last Friday. It said Hamas's attack on Israel, October 7, 2023, and Israel's subsequent attacks on Gaza, followed by divisions around the world over what caused the conflict and who was at fault. So here's the Washington Post, and I bring this up because I know little Israel has had pretty deep political divisions as well, and there's plenty of
yes, absolutely,
left-wing outlets over there as well. But what you just kind of talked about the resolve of the Israeli people and how that they're prepared, it seems, to go it alone if they have to, and to survive this conflict and to utterly, destroy the Hamas network. But what has been the Israeli, media? What have they been like following October 7? And do you have that sort of commentary still that's coming out of some of the left-wing news outlets?
Oh, it's just terrible. The Israeli media is pretty terrible. I mean, I don't have good enough Hebrew to read it and to follow it, but I get the general gist.
Yeah.
And it's just leftist mainly. They're very anti-Netanyahu. Everything is projected through the prism of that, and it's just like, the people who can't see anything beyond their hatred of President Trump. It distorts how they see the world, how they see facts, how they see facts unfolding before them. They can't see certain facts if it gets in the way of that narrative, hatred of President Trump. Similarly with Prime Minister Netanyahu, when you don't have to be a fan of Netanyahu to see that there is something profoundly dysfunctional about the way in which the media approach him and approach the war and the challenges facing Israel. So yes, it is very distorted. Look, I mean, you talk about divisions; they are profound. They are very damaging. The Jews are the most quarrelsome people on earth and always have been. And there is no way in which Israel will ever be anything other than quarrelsome. There is a very significant number of Israelis who are, they were demonstrating against a judicial reform program in the 2 years before October 7. It was actually a kind of proxy for their hatred of Netanyahu, their determination to get rid of him. And unfortunately, and it's a terrible thing to say and to see, they have the same kind of the same people have basically hijacked the appalling hostage dilemma that Israel's facing, hijacked it and used it as a weapon against Netanyahu in the most disgusting, stomach-turning way. So there are a lot of these people. They're on the streets frequently. Their numbers of these demonstrations range between tens of thousands to, at the most, I think, 500,000. These are big demonstrations. Israel, however, is a country, the population is something like now it's about 10 million. We're talking about overall a small minority. It's very hard to see it as a small minority because they're so noisy, they're very influential, they tend to be the intelligentsia, the elites, the cultural elites, people who run the media, lawyers. So the impression is given very easily that Israel is a country that's divided down the middle and it's at its own throat the whole time. Notwithstanding the noisiness and reach of these people that are demonstrating, they are a minority. I would say, rough rule of thumb, I mean, it's my guess, something like 80% of the population is pretty centrist, staunchly behind the war. They may dislike Netanyahu. They may think that he shouldn't remain in office. Many people think this. He should have resigned on October the 8th and said, I was the prime minister, I presided over this calamity. And he didn't, and people resent that. There's a lot of criticism of his way he's conducted the war, but put that to one side. The vast majority of the Israelis want this war to be continued until Hamas is destroyed and the hostages are returned. And they are staunch in that. The worst thing they can imagine is that Israel will have sacrificed so many of its wonderful young people to this war for nothing if they end the war without it being won, without their objectives having been reached. That's what's motivating the vast majority of people, and the vast majority of people, notwithstanding the terrible divisions between them and the quarrelsome nature of it. Again, it's such an amazingly inspiring thing to realize this and to feel this, that notwithstanding all these divisions, ultimately, all these warring tribes in Israel have each other's back. They will die for each other. They are united by the idea, the belief that the cause they are all involved in is the cause of the Jewish people and its continuation, in the nation of Israel. And that includes now an increasing number of Israeli Arabs who have signed up completely to the project of the Jewish nation because they believe in it. They understand what it does for them. They understand that this is the freest and best society they could possibly hope to live in as Arabs. And they are committed to it. And they are fighting alongside Jews and Druze and others in the Israel Defense Forces. Israeli Arabs are fighting and dying alongside them. And this is what people, again, don't really understand in the West. Yes, it's a Jewish country. It's a Jewish nation. It is the fulfillment of Jewish people in the land of Israel. But it's a nation that's made up of many different cultures and ethnicities who pull together. Ultimately, they have each other's back. And this is a fantastically inspiring thing to feel. And it's something, again, that the West just doesn't understand.
Yeah. So what do you feel like, what do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu's political future looks like?
I haven't got the faintest idea. I mean, the man is a political Houdini. You know, he's been written off so many times. He's come back. I don't know. I mean, you know, he's now of a certain age. He's not in the best of health. Who knows? Who knows whether, you know, who knows what's in his mind? I mean, it would seem that, you know, he has set himself certain goals and he wants to fulfill them. What are those goals? To destroy the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran forever, and to produce a regional peace in which the Arab war against Israel would finally be brought to an end through some sort of expansion of the Abraham Accords, some sort of settlement which brings in the Arab world to stop the war, because it's not a war between Israel and the Palestinians. It's a war waged by the Arab world against Israel, in which the Palestinian Arabs have been used as pawns in order to suborn the minds of Western idiots and naive people in the West who don't understand what they're dealing with, and who imagine that this is a war of colonial conquest in which the Palestinian Arabs are the victims and the oppressed. They don't understand, but Netanyahu understands, obviously. This is a war, 100 years war, waged by the Islamic world against the Jewish homeland.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu, I think, has it in his mind that he can now see a path to ending that war forever. And I think that's what he wants to do. I think he would have to be dragged out kicking and screaming from his role as prime minister before he's achieved both of those aims. But who knows? I mean, you know, I can't tell what's in the man's mind. Israeli politics are so dysfunctional and so bizarre. I couldn't possibly predict how this is going to unfold.
Do you feel like an Israeli strike on Iran is imminent? There's been a little bit of chatter on that in recent days. Is that just speculation?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know. I have no idea. I have no way of knowing. Nobody has a way of knowing.
Yeah.
Nobody. I mean, we're getting all this stuff. Who knows? There are so many agendas. You can't believe what you read.
Yeah.
I wouldn't like to say Israel. I mean, Netanyahu said, you know, they're not going to get it. They're not going to get the bomb. We're going to stop it. Well, can they stop it? My understanding, what I read, is that they have the means, if they so wish. They went to war against Iran. They have the means to do terrible damage to the nuclear program, but not to finally eradicate it. Only America can eradicate it. And I don't know whether that's true, but that's what I read.
Yeah.
So answer is, I have no idea. I never predict the future. I just look at what I'm seeing, try and understand it, try and analyze it, and explain that as best I can.
Right. How I mentioned earlier, you've written some pretty strong articles in recent months. I mean, what kind of, just on a personal note here before we conclude, what kind of criticism do you face? I guess it'd be mostly just online comments and things of that nature, but do you operate mostly as an independent journalist? I mean, we see your columns appear in a lot of different outlets. So do you feel like that lets you speak a little more freely? But then again, is there any blowback from, you know, organizations or friends, or when you do write something that is especially strong?
Well, I've lived in professional and social fire for 3 decades. I worked for 20 years for The Guardian, 10 years of which I was in a kind of internal exile before I finally left them, and started working for what they would call right-wing newspapers. I became a freelance. That is to say, I'm an independent operator. And I currently write a weekly column for the Times of London as an independent freelance, but under contract to the Times of London and for the Jewish News Syndicate.
Okay.
And I write my website, on my blog on my website, melaniephillips.substack.com, where I put all my work and I write books. So uh, since the late 1980s, when I started writing op-eds for The Guardian, and almost immediately wrote against the governing orthodoxies of the day, I have been, cancelled. I was cancelled long before all the word was invented, blacklisted by major publishing houses in Britain. Certainly, I lost all the friends that I had on the left. And I now have new friends and new colleagues, and so I go on. But those of us who fight against the prevailing orthodoxies, who write against the grain like this, and there are a few of us in Britain, in America, elsewhere. We all basically face the same kinds of pressures, which are pretty intense. And we rely on one thing alone, which is that there are millions and millions of people, ordinary, decent, sane people, among the general public who really do get it, who may not think deeply about stuff that's going on. They're preoccupied, obviously, by their own lives, what's really important in their lives, their families, their work, so on. But they get it. They understand what's at stake instinctively, and they're with us.
Yeah.
And they tell us that they're with us. And speaking for myself, I have drawn not just comfort and consolation, but it's been it's been what's kept me going all these years. Because as much as the intelligentsia, the left, the people who run the newspapers, run broadcasting, run the cultural life of the country, as much as they vilify me in social media or whatever they do, I know that there are countless numbers of people who are cheering me on, and that has kept me going.
Yeah. Yeah. What was that? The book many years ago, you talked about your history at The Guardian and then getting out of that and becoming more independent.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Guardian Angel or?
Yeah, I wrote a small political and personal memoir, which was published in 2018,
Okay.
called Guardian Angel. I think the subtitle was My Journey from Leftism to Sanity.
Yeah, that's a great book, by the way. And this is your latest, The Builder's Stone. We can just give this a plug here at the end. Maybe you can tell our viewers how they can go about, I assume it's through all the traditional means to order books, Amazon and such, but is there a particular outlet you'd like to point them to?
It's Amazon. It's not, you won't find it in bookshops.
Okay.
Because it's published through a means called print on demand, which means that it's published when you buy the book on Amazon. When you click buy, they publish the book.
Okay.
So that's how you get it.
So is that through a U.S. publisher or British or?
Amazon.com for US. I mean, in Britain, Amazon.co.uk. In Australia, it's the Australian version of Amazon. It's your your national Amazon outlet.
Okay. So but the publishing house, did you just kind of go through this yourself as an independent author?
No. It's published. No. It's published in America by Wicked Sun.
Okay.
Which is a publisher based in New York.
Yeah. And then you mentioned your Substack page. Any other social media accounts that our viewers could be made aware of?
No, my Substack page is where it's at. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I don't use it very much. I use it mainly to advertise what I'm writing.
Okay.
But it's my Substack page, which is the one that people should go to, melaniephillips.substack.com.
Okay. And then how much longer does your U.S. book tour go?
About 2 days.
Oh, and then
I will have been here about 3 weeks.
Okay. And are you going to be back in Israel or the UK?
Yes, I'm going back to to Israel at the and well, I'm due to arrive back there on Thursday evening.
Okay. Just letting you know, we've got our very campus here produces this wonderful Irish dance show called Celtic Throne. They're actually touring in Israel in 2 weeks, 2 shows in Tel Aviv, Beersheba, Haifa, and Jerusalem. So I'll have Sam, the producer, contact you and see if we can get you some tickets for the Jerusalem show. I forget the
Very
exact
nice.
date that it's on, but you'll love it. And I think the very first show in Tel Aviv is very nearly sold out. So
Right, very good.
it sounds like it's going to be a fantastic tour for our young people here on campus. And maybe we'll
Sounds
have a
very nice.
chance to see you again in passing in Jerusalem. Melanie Phillips.
I hope we'll meet again somewhere or other.
For sure. Thank you for joining us on the Trumpet Daily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.